So just to make sure we're on the same conversation, are we thinking that climate change is what we're discussing, or are we thinking resource depletion is this thing, or are we talking about danger of nuclear power? Or like in my mind, very often I think climate change is the issue, but there are other people that think water shortages and food shortages are much more risk. So what is it, if there's a hierarchy of what we're actually most concerned about, what's the hierarchy that in your mind, if you have children and in 30 years you're concerned about something, what's the hierarchy of what you're concerned? Are you more concerned about climate change? Are you more concerned we're not going to have water, or we're going to have storms? How do you see it?
I mean, if we allow the path, imagine the path we're on from energy, water, nuclear, climate, food, and all of the issues and disease, just go 30 years forward on the current path. They're all going to be a problem. But I think we agreed that climate, if we allow CO2 to climb to 600 or 800 and the planet to be 4 or 5 degrees warmer, everything gets worse. Disease, water, weather changes, etc. It's not to say it's a more pressing concern, but it's a slower one to reverse. You can fix a lot of other things in 30 years. You can't reverse climate change in 30 years. This is the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think all these things are so intricately linked that in some ways it's a mistake to try to pull one out and say this is the big problem. And also the solutions are going to be intricately linked. And I think we have to look at things like, we're going to have to reinvent our food supply. We're going to have to reinvent our patterns of human settlement. We've got, people live in ways that are, live out in suburbs, and our solution to that is to build a Tesla so people can drive comfortably back and forth on electric power. But really what we have to do is completely reinvent the suburb and figure out how we change that into something that looks, more like a 17th century village where people lived together and worked closely together and walked a lot, and you didn't think in terms of, I'm going to go drive 20 miles to where I work. That is totally unsustainable.
Well, as I spoke this morning as a physician, and we both are, if we have a patient with a complex set of symptoms, we take a very detailed history, we take their clothes off and thoroughly examine them, we do a series of laboratory tests when indicated, we make the diagnosis, and we concentrate on the most pressing issue for that patient. And that's what the President could do is bring together a group of highly trained scientists and physicians and sit around as we do when we've got a complex patient with renal disease and neurological disease and work out how best to approach the treatment of this patient. And the planet is the patient in the intensive care unit at the moment. It's very complex, but the solutions actually can be implemented. They're there, but it takes a lot of very careful thinking. In terms of what I find the most severe issues facing the planet are, number one, and I talked about this morning, nuclear war. I kid you not, the situation in the Ukraine between Russia and America is extremely serious. I told you that Putin has his weapons on a higher state of alert. I told you that America probably does. I told you they're conducting nuclear war exercises very close to each other's border. They're being very belligerent. And I said to my family, I'll be home if there isn't a nuclear war, and I mean it. And there's nothing in the media about it really at all. Everyone's practicing psychic numbing. If there's a nuclear war, there will be no future, and our children have no future. Number one, so that we must abolish nuclear weapons rapidly, and the only country that can initiate that is America. If America moves, then Russia will, she said she will, and the other nuclear nations will. So that's imperative. And I've told you at the UN, they've just been discussing this last week for a few weeks, and the nuclear nations blocked any move towards rapid bilateral nuclear disarmament. That's number one. Number two, global warming is extremely serious, and there are solutions if we put our heads together. We're highly intelligent. If we're well motivated, we can work it out. I don't know about the free market. I won't get into that. And the third thing is, well, Seth has a lot of solutions. Nuclear power, Seth said this morning, you have to build one nuclear power plant every week until 2050 to make, every day to 2050 to make any difference at all in global warming. But wait a minute. So then I'd educate people about nuclear power and shut it down because they're cancer factories and bomb factories. Period. Those are the three most important issues that I see as a physician facing our children as a paediatrician.
So a few things. First, I guess nuclear war would solve global warming.
It would. Nuclear winter, absolutely. Yep.
And a lot of these other problems, population growth.
Everything.
So I think a lot of the challenges that Steve described all come back to one thing, as I alluded to before, the food challenges, water scarcity. A lot of these are dramatically exacerbated by climate disruption. That's what wreaks havoc on agriculture, which is where the food comes from, and we can't grow the crops properly because we don't have reliable water resources that we can depend upon because the weather keeps going crazy because of climate disruption. So it all comes back to that in my mind. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Would you clarify what?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Let me, just to pick up on what you said about the nuclear power,
Yeah.
just to make sure we set the
understand.
record straight. What I was saying is that to get to a scale where you could power the entire planet exclusively with nuclear power, in the year 2050, you would have to build a new nuclear power plant every day starting today until then. You could make a dent in the energy mix. I mean, we are making a dent in the energy mix with it today.
So I just wanted to make one point. Nuclear power is a potent source of global warming because nuclear reactors don't stand alone. No, they don't produce any CO2 when you fission uranium, but you have to dig up millions of tons of earth and uranium to fuel a reactor. Then you have to mill it, enrich it, which uses a hell of a lot of energy. 2 huge coal-fired plants at Paducah produce the electricity to enrich the uranium. And then you have to build a reactor, and then you have to store the waste safely and cool it for many years, and then you have to store it isolated for 1 million years, according to the EPA, isolated from the ecosphere. So nuclear power on its own, and there's a wonderful man called Storm van Leeuwen, a Dutchman, who's done the whole nuclear fuel cycle or chain, and the amount of CO2, CFCs, and other global warming gases that are produced to produce a nuclear power plant. So it's a myth that nuclear power is clean, green, and sustainable. It's a lie.
Oh.
And the first chapter of my book, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, deals with that specific issue.
I think we know, Helen, your position very clearly. You're very consistent, and that's great. But
it's scientific.
Okay, Helen. What I think we need to do is start to think about a different world of the future, okay? And of course yours is without any nuclear. But I do think we need to begin thinking almost like architects here, which Robert's first comment made me think of, that if you go back 200 years to a different world that you think, and both of you alluded to it, that was sustainable but without electricity, if you will. But we can't go back to that world exactly. And the problem is that our population has risen tenfold in the intervening 200 years. And not only are we addicted to cell phones and internets and Twitters and all these other things, but we have to be practical here, because either we're going to learn from our disasters and mistakes, all of them, from drinking water to nuclear to coal and tar sands and so on, overfishing the seas and mercury-laden fish and all these other things that we've got going on, and how it affects our bodies. I mean, we know that this current path is headed to disaster. We are headed over the cliff, right? I think we all agree that. If we don't make some change this century, it's a very bleak situation, even absent nuclear war, okay? That from a drinking water supply and protein and health and so on, that we have a very dire situation. So maybe one way to think of it isn't what we need to do tomorrow, what the president would say tomorrow, et cetera, but to say, here we are, headed 7 billion, headed to 10 billion, with all these tensions. What could society look like, knowing what we know as humans? We're going to probably go through a dark period to get to a better period. I mean, I don't think we're going to instantly improve this starting tomorrow. But the fact is, we're probably going to hit the wall on some things with climate. It's probably going to get worse. The ice is going to melt, sea level is going to rise. We're having a shortage of water in California. We're going to have to cut out some agriculture because of water usage. I think one of the interesting ways to think about it is say, okay, let's imagine 3 or 4 generations hence. What would the world look like? Would we have these self-encompassed cities? Well, those were designed, actually. There are cities in America that have been like that, where people live and work. Columbia, Maryland was one of them, for example. There are a number of communities like that, and I think that does have some promise. But again, when you get to 10 billion people, and them all wanting to live at our lifestyle, as Helen said yesterday, that everybody emulates America, you know, what does that world look like is an interesting question, because saying we can get smart people around the table and figure it out, I think ignores the realities when you look at implementing any solution today. I mean, our government's going to stay. Is it going to be a world government? Is it going to be the nations we know today, or when nations start going underwater and cities start going, you know, underwater and things like that, do national governments start dissolving? Do we go into city-states more? I mean, not to be too radical, but one or the other is going to happen. I don't think we will stay with the present few hundred nations 100 years from now. I do think we're either going to have more of a global governance, which is hard to imagine, or more of a localized governance. Because in a lot of places, they're going to have to start fending for themselves. A lot of cities today say, well, I'll deal with this when the government pays me to, as if the federal government has enough money to keep funding things. So we need to think about this governance structure, I think.